Happy belated MLK Day. That was actually a couple of days ago. I just got a softball for an opportunity to post this video because interestingly, I randomly found myself in a conversation with some friends because it came up that Martin Luther King Jr. didn't believe in certain ideas that a lot of Christians today believe, at least evangelical Christians. He didn't believe that Jesus was God, that is, a member of the Trinity. Didn't believe that the virgin birth happened, or didn't believe in hell, things like this. And this conversation ended up interesting for me because the tenor of it was sort of making fun of this and talking about King as though he was foolish for not believing these things that are, so clearly true, or at least should be considered true if you're a Christian, right? And in this moment, I really kept my mouth shut in this conversation just for a variety of reasons. It wasn't really the time to start a theological conversation. But it was strange, it was a strange feeling, but not an unfamiliar one, because it kind of showed this sort of widespread lack of awareness, at least amongst people of, my communities, evangelical Christianity in particular. This lack of awareness about different sorts of Christian beliefs. This one in particular, so these things that Martin Luther King Jr. did not believe, would have put him kind of in the camp of liberal theology. And so these ideas within this realm of Christian theological thinking, they're valid, they're steeped in a variety of deep philosophical and biblical scholarship arguments. But it's just somewhat disappointing to, hear people talk about it as though, King was foolish for thinking these things or not thinking these things, especially considering he was a theologian himself. And one person even asked the question, is he in heaven? And so there are a couple of problems with this question. One is this language of even just how that question is asked. I don't believe actually reflects the idea of what heaven really means for a Christian. And it also raises the issue that there's sort of an underlying assumption for many people today that eternal salvation is dependent on the things that we think or believe. And so this conversation just demonstrated this issue, this very common issue that, many people now, largely conservative evangelicals, but a lot of Christians in different sorts of, in different camps, they seem to think or tend to think that their way of thinking, in particular Orthodox, traditional Orthodox Christian thinking, is the only one that's ever existed. And the reality is that that's simply not true. Christian theology has always existed in a variety of forms. It's been very diverse throughout history, even from the very beginning of its emergence. You've got people like Marcion and Arius and the Docetists and various other groups early on in Christianity that didn't have these what are now considered traditional Orthodox beliefs. And they are considered heretics because, groups of people decided that their beliefs were false. The question is, well, who is it that determines who's right about that, right? And so this is kind of an issue with modern thinking within these certain Christian theological camps. They look back at those who have been in power enough so to decide what is true and what is orthodox and what is not. And they kind of imagine that anybody who thinks outside of that is not a Christian. But these people, like Marcion and Arius, they were Christians. They just didn't believe precisely these exact things that kind of became known as Orthodox Christian thinking. In any case, this idea of liberal theology is another form of this divergent thinking within Christianity. I've mentioned elsewhere that it has its roots in Friedrich Schleiermacher, who published his systematic work in the early 19th century. It was actually an apologetic response to the Enlightenment and all of the philosophy that was coming out. And even in this time frame, biblical scholarship and science were sort of beginning to demonstrate that there are lots of things in the Bible that simply can't be true. And so this liberal theology that emerged at this time was a new way of thinking about the faith. And a crude summary of it is it's based in this idea of the God consciousness, which kind of shifts these Christian values from literal, physical truths to more spiritual, ontological, metaphysical truths. And that doesn't mean that it's not true in some sense. But what it does is it makes it so that it's no longer required to think of the virgin birth as a literal occurrence, or Jesus's resurrection, physical resurrection, as a literal occurrence. But it maintains the idea that Jesus was divine in a sense that he was most connected to the God consciousness, and we can all have that in the same way that Jesus did. And so there's much more to it. But the point is that it's just a different framework for understanding what the Bible had said and what Christian tradition has always been about. And it's important to note that these ideas, they're based in deep philosophical thinking and deep biblical scholarship, really. The thing that's kind of upsetting is when people now kind of look at this way of thinking and they make fun of it and kind of rebuff it. And I think that's simply because they don't understand it or they don't know enough about it. It is important also to note that this is the sort of thinking that Martin Luther King Jr. Was a proponent of, and he thought this way himself, and he made a major, hugely important contribution to our modern society. So that's somewhat telling. There are other ways of thinking that have also prompted people to make really significant and important changes as well. But point being is there is fruit that came from his way as well. So at the very least, it's certainly not something that can be kind of rebuffed or waved away as though it's silly or something like that.